the winter of 1959, 9 young hikers stepped off a train in a small northern town in the Soviet Union and vanished into a stretch of mountains that locals treated like a warning sign. They were students, mostly in their early 20s, and they were not amateurs. Each of them had enough experience to qualify for the highest hiking certification available at the time. Their leader was a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov, and the trip had been approved as a top-level expedition, the kind that looked good on a resume and proved you could handle the harshest winter terrain in the Urals. A 10th member started the journey with them. His name was Yuri Yudin. He was also experienced and determined, but he suffered from health issues that he tried to ignore. For several days, the group moved north, deeper into the wilderness, riding trucks as far as the last inhabited settlement before continuing on skis. On January 28th, Yudin's condition worsened. His joints swelled, his strength faded, and the pain became impossible to hide. He knew he could not continue. He turned back alone. He watched the other 9 disappear into the trees, assuming he would see them again in a couple of weeks, tired but alive, carrying stories they would exaggerate for the rest of their lives. He never saw them again. After Yudin left, Dyatlov's group continued toward their destination, a remote mountain called Atorten. Their route forced them through a high pass and across open slopes where the wind had nothing to slow it down. In their diaries, the hikers remained upbeat. They joked. They complained about the cold. They took photographs of each other in the snow. Nothing in their writing suggested fear or conflict. On February 1st, the weather closed in. Visibility dropped as snowstorms swept across the slope. Wind erased their tracks almost as soon as they were made. At some point, the group drifted off course and ended up on the eastern slope of a mountain called Kholat Shakhl, a barren, exposed place above the tree line. Below them, less than 2 kilometers away, was a forest that could have offered shelter. They chose not to descend. Instead, they pitched their tent on the slope itself, cutting into the snow to create a platform. It was a calculated decision, one that experienced hikers sometimes make to preserve altitude or practice slope camping. The tent was secured. Gear was arranged. Boots were placed neatly inside. Then they went to sleep. What happened next is known only through what was left behind. The group never returned. By February 12th, the day Dyatlov had promised to send a telegram confirming their return, nothing had arrived. At first, no one panicked. Delays were common. But as the days passed, concern grew into alarm. Families demanded action. Search teams were assembled. Volunteers went first, followed by soldiers, police, and aircraft. On February 26th, searchers spotted something unnatural on the side of Kholat Shakhl, a tent. It was partially collapsed and buried in snow. When rescuers reached it, they immediately knew something was wrong. The tent was empty. Boots, clothing, food, and equipment were still inside, exactly where they had been left. Then they saw the damage. The tent had been slashed open, not from the outside, from the inside. Outside, 9 sets of footprints led away from the tent and down the slope toward the forest. Some prints were made by people wearing socks. Some showed a single boot. Others were barefoot. There was no sign of panic, no running. Just a steady line of people walking away from their only shelter. After about 500 meters, the tracks vanished beneath drifting snow. At the edge of the forest, beneath a tall Siberian pine, searchers found the remains of a small fire. Nearby lay the first 2 bodies. Both were shoeless and dressed only in underwear. Above them, branches were broken high in the tree, as if someone had climbed up, possibly to look back toward the slope or search the darkness. Between the pine tree and the tent, 3 more bodies were found, spaced along the route uphill. Their positions suggested they had tried to return to the tent and collapsed one by one. The first 5 hikers had died from hypothermia. 4 were still missing. Winter held the mountain for weeks. When spring finally began to loosen its grip, searchers returned to the forest and pushed deeper into the ravines beyond the pine tree. On May 4th, they found the last 4 hikers buried beneath several meters of snow near a stream. Unlike the others, these hikers were better dressed. Some wore clothing that clearly did not belong to them, taken from the dead in an attempt to survive. but their injuries did not match exposure alone. One had catastrophic damage to the skull. Two had severe internal chest injuries, the kind normally seen in high-speed vehicle crashes. Yet, there were no corresponding external wounds, no signs of a fight, no evidence of another group. There were other disturbing details: soft tissue damage to faces, missing eyes. In one case, a missing tongue. Later forensic analysis suggested that many of these injuries occurred after death, caused by months of exposure to water, ice, and scavenging. The official Soviet investigation concluded that the hikers had died due to a compelling natural force. No criminal charges were filed. The case was closed and archived. For decades, speculation filled the silence left by that conclusion. Some spoke of military tests. Others pointed to strange lights reportedly seen in the sky that night. Theories involving secret weapons, radiation, and cover-ups spread widely. But one fact remained unchanged. There was no evidence that anyone else had been there. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case. In 2020, they announced a revised conclusion. The most likely cause, they said, was an avalanche or slab snowslide. According to this explanation, the hikers weakened a layer of snow when they cut their campsite into the slope. Hours later, a heavy slab of snow shifted, pressing down on the tent and blocking the entrance. Believing they were about to be buried, the group cut their way out and moved downhill toward the forest, following standard avalanche safety instincts. In darkness, wind, and extreme cold, small mistakes became fatal. Some built a fire. Some tried to return to the tent. Others sought shelter deeper in the forest. None survived the night. Modern studies suggest that a slab avalanche combined with a fall into a ravine could explain the internal injuries found on the last 4 hikers without leaving obvious external wounds. The explanation is plausible, but it does not erase the final image. 9 capable people walked away from their shelter in the middle of the night and disappeared into a storm that erased their footprints and their chance of survival. Years later, the pass near the site would be named Dyatlov Pass. A memorial stands near the slope where the tent once stood, and the detail that refuses to fade is the one that still feels wrong, even now. They did not unzip the door. They cut their way out from the inside. In late February of 1978, 5 young men left their homes in Northern California to attend a college basketball game and never returned. They were known to their families simply as the boys. All 5 lived with their parents in Yuba City and nearby Marysville. Each had some level of intellectual disability or psychiatric condition, but they were independent enough to maintain routines, jobs, and friendships. When they spent time together, it was almost always centered on sports. They played basketball on a team sponsored by a local support program, watched games together, and talked constantly about the next one. The group consisted of Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, Ted Wire, Jack Madruga, and Gary Mathias. Mathias stood apart from the others in subtle ways. He was an Army veteran who had developed schizophrenia while stationed overseas and was discharged early. After returning home, he struggled for years before stabilizing under treatment. By 1978, his doctors considered him one of their most successful patients. On the night of February 24th, the 5 men drove north to Chico, California, to watch a basketball game at California State University, Chico. Madruga drove his turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego, the only car among them. They wore light jackets, enough for the valley at night, but not for higher elevations. After the game ended, they stopped at a small market near closing time to buy snacks, sodas, and milk. The clerk remembered them because they delayed her from locking up. That was the last confirmed time all 5 were seen together. When morning came and they had not returned home, their families contacted police. At first, investigators assumed the men had taken an unexpected detour or stayed overnight. Searches focused on the normal route between Chico and Yuba County. Nothing turned up. Several days later, a forest ranger reported seeing a car matching Madruga's Montego abandoned along a remote mountain road in Plumas National Forest. Deputies followed him there on February 28th. The car was found 70 miles from Chico, far from any logical route home. It sat partially surrounded by snow, near where the road was closed for winter. The vehicle was not damaged. The gas tank still held fuel. When officers hot-wired it, the engine started immediately. 5 men could have pushed it free. Inside the car were empty snack wrappers, basketball programs, and a neatly folded road map. The car was unlocked. One window was rolled down. The keys were missing. Family members were stunned. Madruga hated cold weather and avoided the mountains whenever possible. Search efforts were delayed by heavy snowstorms. Conditions were so severe that rescuers nearly became lost themselves. Eventually, the search was suspended. Then a local man came forward. Joseph Shons reported that he had spent that same night stuck in his car a short distance up the road. While trying to free his vehicle, he began suffering what he later learned was a heart attack. Hours later, in severe pain, he saw headlights behind him and heard people talking. He called out for help. The voices stopped. The lights went out. Later, he saw flashlights moving nearby. When he called again, those lights also went dark. Shons survived the night and passed the abandoned Montego on his way down the mountain. Doctors later confirmed he had suffered a heart attack. Investigators could not verify his account, but it added another layer of unease to an already inexplicable case. Months passed. No trace of the men was found. In June of 1978, after the snow began to melt at higher elevations, a group of motorcyclists came across a Forest Service trailer deep in Plumas National Forest. A window had been broken. When they opened the door, the smell told them what they were about to find. Inside, on a bed, lay the body of Ted Wire. Wire had been wrapped in sheets. He had lost nearly half his body weight. The condition of his beard suggested he had survived for weeks, possibly months, after the night the group disappeared. The cause of death was starvation combined with hypothermia. His feet were severely frostbitten. His shoes were missing. Outside the trailer were sheds filled with food, matches, heavy clothing, and fuel. The heating system had never been used. A locker stocked with enough dehydrated food to last a year had never been opened. Not far from the trailer, searchers found skeletal remains belonging to Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling, scattered by animals. Both had died of hypothermia. 2 days later, Jack Hewitt's remains were found under brush farther uphill. His death was also attributed to exposure. Gary Matthias was not among them. Inside the trailer, investigators found Matthias's shoes. Military-style ration cans had been opened using a tool familiar only to Matthias or Madruga from their army service. The way Wire's body was wrapped suggested that someone else had been present after his death. Authorities believed the group may have followed tracks left by a snowcat, assuming shelter was nearby. Madruga and Sterling likely collapsed first. Hewitt followed. Wire and Matthias reached the trailer. At some point, Wire died. Matthias may have left afterward, possibly confused, unmedicated, and believing he could still reach help. No trace of him has ever been found. Despite decades of investigation, no definitive explanation exists for why the men abandoned their car, why they traveled so deep into the mountains, or why a trailer filled with supplies became a place of slow death rather than survival. The case remains unresolved, and the detail that continues to unsettle investigators is not just that they got lost, it is that they went somewhere they were never meant to be. In early December of 1958, the Martin family lived a quiet, ordinary life in northeast Portland. Kenneth Martin was 54 years old. He worked as a salesman and kept a steady routine. His wife, Barbara, was 48, known to friends as practical and attentive. Together, they were raising 4 children. The oldest, Donald, was already grown and away from home, serving in the United States Navy on the East Coast. At home with them were their 3 daughters, Barbara, who everyone called Barbie, age 14, Virginia, 13, and Susan, 11. They lived on Northeast 56th Avenue, in a neighborhood where routines rarely changed. Neighbors noticed when someone missed work. Teachers noticed when students didn't show up. People expected things to follow patterns. On the evening of Saturday, December 6th, Kenneth and Barbara attended a Christmas party. It was a normal seasonal event. They returned home that night, made plans for the next day, and went to bed with no indication that anything was wrong. The next morning, Sunday, December 7th, the family decided to take a short day trip into the Columbia River Gorge. They planned to gather greenery to make Christmas wreaths and decorations. It was a common tradition. The gorge was scenic, close enough for a casual outing, and familiar to people in the area. Late that morning, they loaded into their cream and red 1954 Ford Country Squire station wagon and headed east. It was not a trip meant to last long. They did not pack heavy clothing or supplies. They did not tell anyone they were leaving town. They dressed for a winter afternoon, not for danger, and not for an overnight stay. What happened after they left Portland is known only through brief encounters. Around 4 in the afternoon, a gas station owner in Cascade Locks later reported selling the Martins 5 gallons of gasoline. He remembered the family clearly enough to recall their car pulling back onto the highway and continuing east. Later, in Hood River, a waitress said she served a family matching their description at a local snack bar. The timing fit, the direction fit. Nothing about the encounter seemed unusual at the time. As daylight faded, other motorists reported seeing a family resembling the Martins along the north side of the Columbia River in Washington state. That detail would later trouble investigators because it suggested the family may have crossed the river, even though their last confirmed stop had been on the Oregon side. Kenneth was reportedly wearing a tan zip-up jacket and dark slacks. Barbara wore a navy coat over layered clothing. Barbie wore rolled cuff jeans and a beige coat. Susan and Virginia were dressed like children on a winter outing, nothing more. That was the last day anyone could say with certainty that the Martin family was alive. They did not return home that night. On Monday, no one panicked. It was winter. Roads could be slow. Plans could change. But by Tuesday morning, December 9th, the absence became impossible to ignore. Kenneth failed to show up for work. Barbie did not arrive at school. Susan and Virginia were also absent. That evening, Kenneth's employer contacted police. Officers went to the Martin home late that night. Inside, the house felt paused rather than abandoned. Laundry sat unfinished in the washing machine. Dishes were drying on the rack. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood, and no indication that anyone had packed to leave. The family's bank accounts were untouched. Search efforts began immediately and grew fast. Law enforcement agencies from multiple counties joined in. Volunteers poured into the Columbia River Gorge. At the time, it became the largest manhunt Oregon had ever seen. Almost immediately, the case developed strange edges. On the same day the Martins disappeared, a stolen car was found abandoned in Cascade Locks. Nearby, a handgun was discovered thrown into brush, stained with dried blood. The weapon was never fully examined, and investigators could not determine whether it was connected to the missing family. The following day, 2 ex-convicts were arrested in the area for car theft. A witness later claimed the men had been inside the same Hood River restaurant as the Martins and left around the same time. Police could never prove the incidents were related, but the timing lingered in the background of the investigation. Then came the sightings. Tips arrived by the hundred. People claimed to see the Martins in other towns, other states. A glove found near Cascade Locks looked similar to one Barbara might have worn. A driver reported seeing a car matching the Martin station wagon speeding along a freeway. Another said a similar vehicle was parked in Montana weeks later. None of it could be confirmed. By February of 1959, one discovery shifted the investigation toward the river. A volunteer searcher found tire tracks near the Dalles that appeared to lead off a cliff toward the Columbia River. Paint fragments recovered nearby were consistent with the Martins Ford station wagon. Authorities began to believe the family's car may have plunged into the river. The Army Corps of Engineers lowered the water level near Bonneville Dam. Sonar scans were conducted. Helicopters searched the shoreline. Divers went into the cold water. Nothing was found. Then, in early May, the river began to answer in a way no one wanted. A drilling rig working near the Dalles snagged something heavy beneath the water, then lost it before it could be brought up. The next morning, A fisherman and his wife reported seeing what looked like bodies floating downstream near Cascade Locks. On May 3rd, 1959, the body of 11-year-old Susan Martin was recovered along the riverbank in Washington. The following morning, her sister Virginia was found near Bonneville Dam. Both girls were identified through dental records. Autopsies concluded that they had drowned. There were early rumors of gunshot wounds, but nothing official supported that claim. Traces of metal were found on Susan's clothing, but investigators could not determine their origin. One theory suggested the family's car had been disturbed on the riverbed, possibly dislodging a door and allowing the girls' bodies to escape and drift downstream. Despite renewed searches, Kenneth, Barbara, and Barbie were never found. The investigation stalled between competing explanations. Some believed the family had suffered a tragic accident. Others suspected foul play, pointing to the tire tracks, the conflicting sightings, and the strange events surrounding the stolen car and the discarded handgun. Years passed. The search faded. The case went quiet. Donald Martin eventually inherited what remained of his family's estate. He built a life elsewhere. He died decades later, never knowing what happened to his parents and sisters. For more than half a century, the Columbia River held its secret. Then, decades later, a submerged vehicle was discovered near Cascade Locks, buried beneath rock and silt on the riverbed. Artifacts recovered from inside, including a camera case bearing Kenneth Martin's name, strongly suggested the car belonged to the missing family. Human remains were also reported inside the vehicle. Even with that discovery, the story did not resolve itself cleanly. The river may have finally revealed where the Martins ended up, but it still does not explain why they drove so far into the gorge, why they may have crossed the river, or what happened in the final moments before the water took them. The Martin family left Portland on a quiet Sunday morning to gather Christmas greenery. Only 2 of them were ever returned, and the rest of the story stayed underwater for more than half a century. Alright guys, that will be it for today. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss next week's upload. I drop new stories every week, so there's always something coming. I'll see you in the next one.